Hello, everybody, and welcome to our 6-week webinar class, The Ideal Qualitative Study with a Quantitative Component. I'm William Bannon of StatsWhisper. Visit us on the web for any resources you may need at statswhisper.com. First of all, we'd like to say welcome and acknowledge that all of you have come here with goals, right? So whether it's a dissertation, a research study, develop new skills, you have goals, and we want to make sure they're met. So feel free to let us know any ancillary way, in addition to these presentations, that you could think of that will make that happen. Now, at a very global level, what we're going to be examining are qualitative data analysis, quantitative data analysis, mixed methods data analysis, right? So we're going to review all the fundamentals as well as how to implement a study for each. So a little less global, a little more specific, the webinar agenda. So week 1, introduction, qualitative analysis, part 1. Week 2, qualitative analysis, part 2. Then 3, we'll be looking at the essentials of a qualitative data analysis. Week 4, the essentials of a mixed methods research study. Right? And then week 5, very useful for qualitative data analysis, looking at statistical analysis with small samples. And then week 6, how to write up and report all the findings of the above. All right, here we go. Week 1. Which is right now, and so it's our introduction to the course, and then we're going to be going into the first part of our qualitative data analysis. So again, our primary goal here is not just to review information, but to illustrate how to apply the materials to produce original research. Okay, so the focus is on making everything practical and usable, and as it says in the text box, the most important 3 words you could say after the webinar is, yes, I can. Feel free to say that to me anytime you like. Okay, now, first, let's consider the classic roles of quantitative research, traditionally research where variables and analysis involve numbers, right? So numbers and statistics, and the classic role of quantitative research, which largely involves words, narratives, text, right? You get the drift, right? In the process of conducting research. So traditionally in qualitative research, we go through the process known as inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning asks, what's going on, right, within the research process? So traditionally what happens is there's an observation of a small number of study participants per se, right? They may be observed in a naturalistic setting. They may be observed, you know, as part of the study, right? But from this observation, a pattern is noticed, right? So the researcher notes patterns, you know, kind of an inkling of what's going on, right? So a tentative hypothesis is developed, right? So what's going on is, you know, A is related to B, or B happens because of A, right? So it's a tentative hypothesis, and it begins to inform theory, right? A theory of what's happening and why, right? Next, we get into the classic role of quantitative research, right, which involves more of deductive reasoning, which kind of confirms, is this what's going on, right, within the research process? So the ball's taken from the qualitative court into the quantitative court, right? So the tentative, you know, hypotheses and the theories developed are now going to be tested, right? So we take the theory and hypothesis, then from an observation, you know, more rigorous research methods, the variables are measured, more precisely with measures typically, and a larger number of study participants are observed, right? And through statistical testing, we either confirm if the theory and hypotheses are supported or not supported. Right? So if we put it together, this is what it looks like. Okay, so this is the classic, right, research process. Two distinct phases. A crescendo, a progression where phase 1 is qualitative, right, and then phase 2 is quantitative. But it's kind of a linear progression, right, from qualitative to quantitative. So what we're suggesting here in our webinar, right, is that these two parallel worlds don't have to be linear, that they can exist side by side. The numbers and words exist side by side to simultaneously inform one research study. Now, let's think about this from a practical standpoint. So, the qualities of a qualitative research study, right? Now, let's think about these strengths because they're formidable. So, the study considers contextual factors, right? The contextual factors that study participants experience, right? The 5 W's. So, you have your study participant, and then we're looking at who, what, when, where, why, like what are all these things, right? Very powerful, and as it says here, very detailed, right? So it's more in-depth, more detailed. You could say that it's a very powerful way to get the perspective of the study participant. Now, in qualitative and quantitative, that perspective is what we're after, right? So if it's quantitative and we're measuring, say, depression on a scale, and it's all numeric, we're still after the perspective of how does that study participant feel, right? It's just not as in-depth, right? Because there's no room for personal commentary a lot, right? So these are considerable strengths for the qualitative research study. Limitations, right? There's no statistics to identify association, right? So the study may say there seems to be an association between X and Y, right? And that might be as far as it goes, right? So there seems to be, but we can't really say definitively if that relationship exists. Also, we can't say, how strong is that relation, right? So it's not as defined, right? And it's also less generalizable because, a smaller sample. So we can't say within our sample this is happening and then suggest, so in the wider community or the wider population, it's also happening there too because it's on a smaller scale, right? So consider if qualitative research was enhanced with a quantitative component, right, you would have all the strengths of a qualitative study, without the limitations, right? So you would have the strengths of the qualitative study, but you wouldn't have the limitations of no statistics and limited generalizability. And I put this image on the right of the snow hiker, and it says life has no limitations except the ones you make, and that's there to remind us. Sometimes, well, all the time studies have limitations, right? But some of these limitations might be addressable, right? So per se, you could have a mixed method study that addresses certain limitations that when you're done with your study, they're no longer there. So in a way, you could say that the methods we choose, we're choosing if some limitations are addressed and not present in a study, and some are. Of course, it's contextual to each study, but it's applicable to some. So the question begs now, could the combination of a qualitative and quantitative methods create a super study? Intriguing. So these two methods are dependent upon one another many times in order to produce sound research, right? We're going to demonstrate that. So the question is how does a purely quantitative and purely qualitative study risk distorted findings, right? Distorted findings mean findings that don't really reflect what's happening, you know, with our sample and the population. So consider the purely quantitative study. Right? Now, suppose we wanted to quantify the level of chronic depression within a community. All right, chronic depression within a community. So to measure depression, perhaps we go to a random street corner in the community and ask the first 100 community members, the first 100 passers-by, on a scale of 1 to 5, how would you rate your level of depression? So, and if you've done quantitative research, you've probably seen this a lot, right? You get back a survey like this, right? So say the blue text is writing inserted by one of the community members who was given the survey, all right? Now the survey just has a 1 to 5 scale, 1 lowest, 5 highest, saying what's your level of depression, right? It doesn't allow room for comments. But like I said, even so, many people write a comment in there because there's something contextual to them that they feel is an important consideration, you know, in their response. Okay, like I said, this is not that uncommon. So you can see here that the person circled 5, so they have the highest level of depression. But they also wrote they're usually a 1, but had a major negative life event the day before. Okay, so think about this conceptually. We're trying to measure chronic depression in the community. So that means chronic means, you know, it's the depression that more or less exists every day for the community member. And it's chronic. It's not episodic like this person, right? They had an episode, and that's what's related to their depression, right? But in this purely quantitative study, they are going to be coded as a 5, right? Meaning that they have the highest level of depression possible. So it looks like from this person's data that the person in the community has the highest level of chronic depression possible. However, that's a total misrepresentation of the construct we're looking at because they're usually a 1. So chronically, they're a 1, right? But this day, because of what happened, it's a 5. So it's a total inversion of what's happening, right? So we can't tell the difference here in the response if the depression is related to chronicness, related to trauma, right? So it's a major shortcoming. And then normally, there's nowhere to enter comments like this, so the comment is just ignored, right? So how can we address this? So if we just added a little old qualitative piece to the bottom of the survey, and we said, right, and then that's the other thing, we have to give everyone a chance to say it because probably if one person wrote it, 10 other people have the same experience and probably didn't write it, right? So you just give a little space, ask if you would like to make a comment. Is there anything that happened lately that impacted your depression? Then we could see when we do analysis, we might choose to leave this person out because we could see their score doesn't represent chronic depression, which we want to see. But if there's nowhere to make a comment, we don't know, right? So this allows, this small qualitative insertion allows for a fuller expression of the perspective of the study participant. Now, the purely qualitative study, right? Now, consider the inability to note the qualitative aspects in that quantitative study, right, might be termed the blind side. That might be the blind side of quantitative research, or one of them, right? In research, we could call the blind side an aspect of the data not visible to the researcher, but makes the study vulnerable to distorted findings, right? It's something we can't see, and it's going to misrepresent our findings. something we do not want. So the purely qualitative study has a blind side too, right? So consider this. Consider we want to look at depression in the community, but instead of our 1 to 5 scale, we have a nice qualitative survey where we just ask people to write down, what kind of things do you see, think about in the course of a day, right, are related to your feeling depressed, okay? So, factors related to depression, that's what we're looking at. Qualitative responses, and again, 100 study participants. So the blind side of the qualitative study might be the failure to report the number of study participants that evidence a certain theme. For example, in many qualitative studies, you might read a statement like this: a theme emerged linking feelings of depression to worries about paying monthly household bills, right? It's a perfectly valid statement, and one the type you'll see a lot in qualitative research. Now, the purely qualitative study doesn't mention the number and percentage of study participants evidencing the theme, right? Computing the number and percentage, right, of study participants that mention a theme is a quantitative method known as a frequency count, right? So a theme, one person says household bills, another person says household bills, one person says monthly bills. So out of 100, how many people gave data like that was referent to worries about monthly household bills being related to depression? We're not sure because we're just told there's a theme. But we don't know the numbers and percentage of people out of 100 that said it, because that's going into the quantitative area. So the blind side of the qualitative study might be, right, that very thing. So was it 70% of people, like 70 out of 100, mentioned that household bill worries, contributed to their feeling depressed? Was it 85%, 85 out of 100, that evidenced this theme? Right? Now, why is this important? Well, researchers are all different, right? Everyone has different criteria. People consider different things valid and not valid. So perhaps your definition of a theme, right, has a different cutoff point, from the author. So perhaps the author feels if 70% of people say it, it's a theme. But perhaps you feel it has to be more like 80% or 85% of the people, to become a theme. If it's less than 80%, you don't consider it a theme, right? Well, if they don't mention the number and percentage, right, you can't make that judgment. So they're telling you it's a theme, but you can't decide if it's really a theme unless you know that number and percentage. And also, the number and percentage makes a big difference in terms of impact and prevalence, right? So if it's a theme at 70% and 70 people say it, that's fine. But if 98 people out of 100 say they have the same worry, that's a big difference in terms of prevalence and impact. If almost everyone says it, it seems a lot more impactful than if only, say, 70 people say it, right? So these are important considerations, important dimensions of the data that we might like to see, but it involves, right, mixing methods, right? So the blind side's addressed by adding the quantitative frequencies count, right? So often the data might be portrayed best, right, by combining these two methods. Now, historically, combining strengths has produced quality results. So I want you to consider one thing, all right? Now, stick with me on this one. In the 1980s, there was a Reese's Peanut Butter Cup commercial where there was an unintentional collision. One person's holding chocolate, the other's holding peanut butter, and when they collide, the two are mixed. And the tagline is, your chocolate's in my peanut butter, your peanut butter's in my chocolate. Now, this commercial actually illustrates some of the issues with combining qualitative and quantitative research very well. Specifically, the commercial suggests that chocolate and peanut butter don't need to be combined, right? And that's true. Sometimes it's fine to just have chocolate. Sometimes it's fine just to have peanut butter, right? So, you know, they may not need to be, but the combination of them is a possibility. Now, when there was that first collision, there was initial resistance, right? If you've ever seen the commercial, both people are actually kind of mad, you know, that there was a contamination, what they considered contamination, with the two foods being combined, right? So sometimes you'll see this in the quantitative and qualitative fields. Like there's almost like a hesitation to combine quantitative and qualitative methods, right? So here's where it crosses, right? But in both cases, the combination may create a much richer product that is possible alone. You see? So sometimes the combination of two things like that produces something really great that you can't get keeping the two separate. Right? So the combination of qualitative and quantitative methods is commonly referred to as mixed methods research, right? Now, it's not just us that sees this combination as valuable, right? So the value of mixed methods research has been recognized, and the use has been growing considerably in recent decades. For example, you'll see here the NIH funding awards of studies that self-identify as mixed methods from 1997 to 2008. See, the red line moving to the right, you know, slopes upwards rather dramatically, indicating, you know, a dramatic increase in the funding of mixed methods research, right? Now, also, if you look at the dissertations and theses, right, with mixed methods in the titles, right? So you can see 1980, 1984, it was 3, but then by 2005 to 2009, it's 2,524. Of course, these are raw numbers, so we don't know what proportion of, you know, the students it is. There may be more students in 2005 to 2009, but nonetheless, looking at the pure numbers, right, there's a lot more students, right? For all the years before 2004 and before, if you add them up, they don't come close to how many were conducted in 2005 to 2009. So you can see mixed methods research has been steadily growing, especially lately. Now, to produce mixed methods, right, a mixed method study, you need knowledge of, as we said, the essentials of producing a qualitative study, right? So you have to be a good qualitative researcher. Then you need the essentials of producing a quantitative study. So you have to be a quantitative, you know, a competent quantitative researcher, right? Then you need to know the essentials of mixed methods research, like how to combine the two. It's rather like, you know, the Reese's peanut butter cup. You have to know how to make the chocolate, you have to make the peanut butter, you have to know how to combine them, right? You can't just jump right into mixed methods research, right? So here we go. This is an important point, right? So you could say it's quite an accomplishment to be competent in qualitative or quantitative research, never mind both, and combining them both, right? So really, when you get down to it, the mixed methods researcher is a Renaissance, you know, man or woman, right? So the literal meaning being a person whose expertise spans a significant number of different subject areas. So it's quite applicable. Okay, now, how are we going to do all this, right? So Aristotle once said, for the things we have to learn before we can do them, we learn by doing them, right? That's not bad, right? So what we have here is we're going to do a sample study, right? Webinar sample study And all our research methods are going to be illustrated and applied, through this sample study. So in this sample study, we'll be going into it more in depth later, but we have administrators at a retirement community, and the retirement community is named Lots of Noise Pines, and they want to encourage meditation class attendance. I guess that's self-evident why, right? So the administrators have noticed some trends, but they want research for detail. They don't want to do things to encourage attendance that aren't supported empirically, so there are kind of administrators, right? They don't want to make the wrong move. The wrong move's costly, right? You may have to either make another move or go back to the way things were, right? So, conservative approach. So what we're going to need to do to implement this study is we first have to analyze survey data that they gathered, right? That's our quantitative analysis. Then we need to conduct and analyze interviews, which will be our qualitative part, right? And then we need to merge and interpret results, right, which is going to be our mixed method study. All right, now we're going to get into quantitative analysis part 1.